You'll waste away in this place. The only exit you'll find is in a coffin. The words of my own son, David, stabbed at my ears like daggers as he shoved me violently into the old country house. The sound of my phone shattering against the wooden floor was the last thing I heard before the lock turned from the outside. David had destroyed my only connection to the outside world. And now I was completely alone, without food, without water, abandoned like an animal in a cage. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. At 68 years old, after giving my entire life to that ungrateful son, I found myself locked away by his own hands, condemned to die of thirst and hunger, while he went off to enjoy a luxury cruise with Chloe, his wife, and that horrible mother-in-law who manipulated him so much. But let me tell you how I got here. How the woman who was once the center of a happy family ended up a prisoner of her own blood. My name is Margaret, and for 42 years I believed I had built a solid family full of love and sacrifice. I worked from the age of 17 as a seamstress in a small textile factory downtown. My hands, rough from so much sewing and embroidering, held our home together when my husband abandoned us when David was just 7 years old. From that moment on, he became my reason for living, the engine that drove me to get up before dawn every morning to get to work on time. I remember perfectly the day I decided I would do anything to give my son the life he deserved. It was a rainy Tuesday in November, and David came home crying because the other kids were making fun of his worn-out shoes. That night, while he slept, I counted every single dollar I had saved for months to buy myself a new winter coat, money I immediately used to buy him the best sneakers in the store. Seeing his smile the next day was worth more than any coat I could have ever bought for myself. And so the years went by. Every extra dollar, every hour of overtime, every moment of rest I sacrificed, it was all for him. When he turned 15, I worked double shifts to buy him the bicycle he was dying for. At 20, I mortgaged my small house to pay for his business degree. I never complained. I never held it against him. I firmly believed that a mother should give everything for her children, expecting nothing in return but their love and respect. David graduated with honors and got an excellent job at a marketing firm. I felt like the proudest woman in the world watching him leave every morning in his sharp suit and leather briefcase. My son is a successful professional, I would tell my neighbors with a smile that came from my soul. During those first few years after his graduation, our relationship seemed perfect. He visited me regularly, took me to nice restaurants for dinner, and always told me how grateful he was for all my sacrifices. Everything changed when he met Chloe. The first time he introduced me to her, something inside me recoiled. It wasn't just her cold, calculating attitude, but the way she looked at my son as if he were an investment that needed to be protected from outside influences. Chloe was 34, tall, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. She worked as a manager at a luxury hotel, and from the very first moment, she made it clear that she considered David's family, specifically me, to be beneath her social standards. During the first few months of their relationship, I tried to get closer to her. I cooked her favorite meals when they came to visit. I bought her small gifts with my meager savings. I even learned to cook sophisticated dishes that I knew she liked. But every gesture of love from me was met with a fake smile and sarcastic comments that my son either didn't seem to notice or, worse, chose to ignore. "Margaret, don't go to so much trouble," Chloe would say in that syrupy voice that grated on my nerves. "We don't need you to do all this. We're not children anymore." The wedding took place 2 years after they met in an elegant hall that cost over $25,000. I, who had dreamed for years about the day my son would get married, felt like a stranger in my own family. Chloe had organized everything without consulting me. "Margaret, darling," she said with that condescending tone I had come to recognize. "This is a modern celebration. I don't think our guests would appreciate those old-fashioned customs of yours. David, who used to defend me from any slight, just nodded and changed the subject. The following months confirmed my worst fears. David's visits became more and more sporadic, and when he did come, it was always with Chloe, and for shorter periods. The conversations that once flowed naturally between us became tense and superficial. "David, don't forget we have that event with my parents," Chloe would say whenever my son seemed to be enjoying our conversation. Or even worse, "Honey, your mother looks tired. Maybe we should go so she can rest." But what hurt the most was seeing how David had started to change. The loving, considerate son I had raised was transforming into someone distant. The first time David spoke to me with contempt was on a Sunday afternoon, 4 months after his wedding. I had cooked his favorite meal, the same pot roast he had loved since he was a boy. "Mom, we need to talk," he said as I served the steaming food in his favorite bowl. "Chloe and I have been talking, and we think it would be better if we started to have more space." "Space?" I asked, feeling my voice tremble. "Chloe feels like we don't have enough intimacy as a couple because I'm always coming over here." "David, you only come once a week," I said, my legs beginning to shake. "That's exactly the problem," he exploded. "I'm all you have. Don't you realize how suffocating that is? I'm 32 years old, Mom. I can't keep being responsible for your happiness." The months passed and the visits became even more scarce. David only showed up when he needed something, to hold important documents, to cook a specific dish to impress Chloe's bosses, or to lend him money. "Mom, could you lend me $6,000? He asked during one of his rare visits. "It's for the down payment on a new car. Chloe's broke down and she needs something more reliable for her job." $6,000 was almost all of my savings. But as always, I couldn't say no to my son. The day I hit rock bottom was a gray Wednesday in January. I had been battling a terrible flu for a week with a high fever. I called David, hoping he could take me to the doctor. "Mom, I can't come over," he said. "Chloe and I have a very important meeting with the interior designer. It took us months to get an appointment." "David, please," I begged, my voice weak from fever. "I just need someone to be with me for a few hours." "Can't you call a neighbor or something?" he replied with irritation. "Chloe says that independent adults should know how to take care of themselves." Those two words, "Chloe says," had become the most painful phrase in my vocabulary. That night, as I lay in my bed shivering with fever, I made a decision that would change everything forever. I could no longer be the begging mother. When I finally recovered, I decided it was time to act. The first test came when David called as if nothing had happened. "Mom, could you make me that apple pie that Chloe loves so much? Her parents are coming for dinner." For the first time in 32 years, I said, "No." The silence on the other end was profound. "Other plans?" he repeated. "What kind of plans could you possibly have?" "My own," I answered with a firmness that surprised me. The next few days were strange. I felt guilty, but also a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. 3 weeks after our phone argument, David showed up at my door unannounced with Chloe. "We need to talk," he said as he walked into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "Of course, make yourselves comfortable," I said sarcastically. "You can start by explaining what's gotten into you lately," David said. "First you hang up on me, then you refuse to help with a simple dessert." "David feels you've been bad-mouthing us to the neighbors," Chloe interjected. "Do you realize the damage that can do to his reputation at work?" "Your reputation?" I asked David directly. "Is that your biggest concern?" "Oh, please," Chloe burst out. "Margaret, you're 68 years old. It's time for you to grow up and stop acting like a spoiled teenager seeking attention." I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me. But David remained silent. I walked to the small table where I kept my important documents and pulled out my will, in which David was the sole beneficiary. "You know what, son?" I said, holding the document in front of him. "You're right. My sacrifices were my decisions. Decisions I now deeply regret." I walked toward the paper shredder and slowly fed the will into the machine. "What did you just do?" Chloe asked, her voice sharp. "I just did what my son asked me to do," I replied. "I stopped making decisions based on a love that is clearly not returned." "You're crazy!" David yelled. "No," I said, feeling a strength I didn't know I possessed. "For the first time in years, I'm thinking with perfect clarity." "Mom, you're going to reverse this right now," David said in a low, controlled voice. "You're going to call your lawyer and make a new will. Or you'll find out what it means to be truly alone." His words were like daggers, but they didn't hurt me like they used to. "I would rather die alone in a nursing home than continue living as the emotional slave of a son who despises me," I replied. "Don't you dare," he shouted, snatching the phone receiver from my hand with a violence that scared me. For the first time in this confrontation, I felt a flicker of real fear. After they left, I waited until I heard their car drive away. Then, with a calmness that surprised me, I went to my room and pulled out the cell phone from under my mattress that I had secretly bought. I dialed the number of Ruth, my neighbor. "Ruth, it's Margaret. Could you come over? I need your help with something urgent." 20 minutes later, Ruth was sitting in my living room, staring at the remains of the phone with horror. "Margaret, this is very serious. We have to call the police." "No," I said. "Not yet. I'm going to handle this my way." I explained my plan to Ruth, who at first tried to dissuade me. But when she saw the remains of the phone and understood what had happened, her expression changed completely. "I need you to be my witness," I said. "I need you to see exactly how they behave with me." The next morning, I called my lawyer and made a new will. At 10 a.m., David and Chloe arrived. "Good morning," I said in a submissive voice. "I was expecting you." "Perfect," David said. "I see a night of reflection helped you see things clearly." "The new will is already done," I informed them. I showed them a fake copy of the document, watching their eyes light up as they read it. "Now that this is settled," Chloe said, "we need to talk about some other practical matters. We think it would be better if you moved to a place more appropriate for your age." "A retirement home," David clarified. "We've been looking at some very good options." "And when would I have to make this transition?" I asked. "The sooner the better," Chloe said. "This house needs renovations if we're going to sell it for what it's really worth." "There's something I need to show you," I said. "It's in the basement." Curiosity got the better of their caution. They followed me down the wooden stairs. The basement was my private sanctuary, the place where I kept all my evidence. Photographs of the times David had pushed me during arguments. Copies of bank statements showing all the loans he had never paid back. Recordings of conversations where they spoke contemptuously of me. "This is my archive," I explained. "Everything you've done, everything you've said, it's all here." In the center of the basement was a table with an open laptop with an active video call. "For the last 20 minutes," I said, "everything we've talked about has been broadcast live to several very important people." The screen showed multiple video windows: my lawyer, a social worker, Ruth, and Ben, my neighbor who worked as an investigative journalist. The police arrived shortly after. 2 officers listened to my story with seriousness. Ruth corroborated everything, and my audio recordings were accepted as evidence. "Mrs. Margaret," one officer asked, Do you want to press formal charges? I looked at David, sitting on my sofa with his head in his hands. I remembered his words, "Nobody asked you to sacrifice your life for me." I remembered the cruel smile with which he had destroyed my phone. "Yes," I replied in a firm voice. "I want to press formal charges." The legal process that followed was devastating. The local newspapers covered the story in great detail. David was fired from his job. Chloe lost her position at the hotel. 3 months later, David showed up at my door alone. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, "can we talk?" I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I replied simply. "We can't." "Please," he begged, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I've lost everything. My job, my reputation, my marriage. Chloe left me last week." "Now you know how it feels," I said with absolute calm. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I know I was terrible to you, but I'm your son. There has to be some way to fix this. I loved you," I corrected him. "I loved the sweet boy who used to hug me when he had nightmares. But that boy died a long time ago." I gently closed the door. I heard his sobs on the other side, but I stood firm. I went to the kitchen where Ruth was waiting with a hot cup of tea. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Free," I answered. "For the first time in 32 years, I feel completely free." That night, as I prepared for bed in my house, which no one would ever take from me, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had lost my only son. But I had gained something infinitely more valuable: my dignity, my self-respect, and the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive alone. At 68, I had learned that self-love is not selfishness, but survival. And for the first time in decades, that prospect didn't scare me. It excited me. Continue to write chapters 16 to 30 of course. Here are chapters 16 to 30, continuing Margaret's story. Chapter 16, The first dawn of freedom. The first morning after closing the door on David was the strangest of my life. I woke at my usual time, the habit of a lifetime, but the crushing weight of obligation was gone. The silence in the house was no longer lonely, it was peaceful. I made a single cup of tea and drank it while looking out at the garden, a simple pleasure I had denied myself for years, always too busy worrying about David's needs. Ruth came over later, and we sat for 2 hours, talking about nothing and everything. It was the first of many slow, unburdened mornings. I was learning to breathe again. The legal machinery I had set in motion began to turn. My lawyer, a sharp, compassionate woman named Ms. Evans, filed the civil suits for financial abuse and property damage. The district attorney's office, armed with the evidence from my basement, pursued criminal charges of intimidation and elder abuse. I gave my deposition, my voice steady as I recounted the events. It was no longer a painful confession, it was a clinical recitation of facts. I was no longer a heartbroken mother on the stand, but a witness for the prosecution. The shift in perspective was my armor. Ben's investigative piece was published. The headline was stark: The Inheritance Plan, a son's blueprint for his mother's disposal. It didn't just use my story, it used my evidence, transcripts of their conversations about the retirement home, photos of the shattered phone. David and Chloe were named. The fallout was swift and public. I was braced for pitying looks from neighbors, but instead, I received quiet nods of respect. Other stories began to trickle out, whispered confessions from friends and acquaintances who had seen similar patterns in their own families. My private hell had become a public cautionary tale. I heard through the grapevine, mostly via Ruth, who had a formidable network, that David's life was in free fall. The scandal made him unemployable in his field. The luxury apartment he shared with Chloe was listed for rent. Then, the news I had half expected but still found shocking: Chloe filed for divorce. Her mother, the architect of so much poison, was reportedly devastated. There was no satisfaction in hearing this, only a cold, hollow confirmation. The life they had built on a foundation of greed and cruelty had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. He came back on a rainy afternoon, looking like a ghost of the man he once was. His clothes were rumpled, his face haggard. "Mom, please," he whispered through the door I kept locked. "I have nowhere else to go." This time I did not feel anger or even pity. I felt nothing, a vast, empty plain where my love for him used to be. "You made your choices, David," I said through the wood. "You have to live with the consequences of them, just as I have had to." "I'm your son," he cried, his voice breaking. "You were," I replied, and walked away from the door. I did not listen to his weeping. I went to the kitchen and baked a cake, filling the house with a warm, sweet scent that slowly chased the lingering sadness away. With the legal settlement from the civil case, the judge ordered David to repay the $47,000 with interest. I had a financial security I hadn't known in years. I didn't hoard it. I used some to fix the leaky roof and repaint the peeling trim. I joined a community gardening group, my rough seamstress's hands finally learning the gentler art of tending to roses. I started having weekly dinners with Ruth and a few other women from the neighborhood. We were a group of widows and spinsters, and we found a powerful, unspoken camaraderie in our self-sufficient lives. A letter arrived from David's now ex-wife. It was not an apology. It was a venom-filled screed blaming me for manipulating David, for ruining her life, for being a vindictive old woman. I read it once, then calmly dropped it into the wood stove. Watching the flames curl the expensive stationery to ash, I felt the last ember of bitterness within me extinguish. Her words had no power over me anymore. She was just a bitter woman shouting into the void, and my life was now too full to hear the echo. True to my new will, I established the Margaret Grant for single mothers. I worked with a financial advisor and a community outreach program to structure it properly. It wouldn't just be a handout, it would provide grants for education, vocational training, and emergency childcare. At the launch, a young woman named Sarah, struggling to raise a toddler while studying to be a nurse, was our first recipient. Seeing the desperate relief in her eyes, the same look I must have had so many times, was more fulfilling than any smile David had ever given me. My legacy would not be a spoiled son, but a helping hand for other women fighting the same battles I had. A routine checkup revealed a small, early-stage cardiac issue. A decade ago, the news would have sent me into a panic, fearing for who would care for David if I were gone. Now, I listened to the doctor, asked pragmatic questions, and started the prescribed medication. I told Ruth, who immediately organized a casserole rotation among our friends. I was not a burden, I was a member of a community. The diagnosis was a reminder of my mortality, but it no longer felt like a threat. It was just a fact of life, to be managed with grace and support. Ms. Evans informed me that David, desperate and destitute, was attempting to contest the new will, claiming I was not of sound mind due to early dementia. I merely smiled and handed her the file containing the reports from 2 independent psychiatrists I had proactively seen, both affirming my sound mental state. We also had the mountain of evidence showing his coercion. His case was thrown out of court, and he was ordered to pay my legal fees. It was the last gasp of a dying fire. I heard he had moved to a different city, chasing a fresh start that would always be tainted by his past. I hosted a summer party in my now thriving garden. Ruth was there, along with Ben the journalist, Ms. Evans, and a dozen other friends I had made. The air was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. As I looked around at the faces of people who valued me for my company, my strength, and my friendship, I felt a profound sense of belonging. This was my family. Not one bound by blood and obligation, but one forged from mutual respect and chosen affection. It was richer and more real than anything I had known before. The days settled into a rhythm that was entirely my own. Mornings for gardening, afternoons for reading or visiting friends, evenings for quiet reflection. The frantic worry that had been the soundtrack of my life was gone. I learned to sit with silence and not interpret it as loneliness. I rediscovered the person I was before I became just David's mother, a woman with her own thoughts, her own interests, her own quiet resilience. The peace I found was not the absence of noise, but the presence of contentment. A year to the day after David locked me in the country house, I did something I had been planning for months. I took a bus trip to the coast, a place I had always wanted to visit but never had the time or money for. I walked on the beach, felt the cold ocean spray on my face, and ate fish and chips from a paper wrapper. I was completely, joyfully alone. That night, in a small inn, I raised a glass of wine to myself. Not to survival, but to my liberation. I had not just survived the unthinkable, I had built a new life from the ashes of the old one. A local community college, having heard about my foundation, asked if I would teach a beginner sewing class. I hesitated, my hands aching at the memory of the factory. But this was different. I was in charge. I taught a small class of enthusiastic young people and retirees, not for a paycheck, but for the joy of sharing a skill. Their excitement as they created their first straight seam was infectious. It transformed a memory of struggle into a source of creativity and connection. My past was no longer a chain, it was a tool I could use to build anew. Today, my life is full. The foundation is helping its fifth mother, a young immigrant woman training to be a welder. My garden is a small paradise of color and life. My friends are my pillars. I sometimes think of David, a fleeting thought like a cloud passing the sun. I feel no hatred, no longing. I feel a distant, quiet sadness for the man he chose to become, a sadness that is no longer a wound, but a scar, a reminder of a battle I fought and won. The woman who was locked away to die was not the end of me. She was the beginning. She taught me that a mother's love should be a gift, not a chain. That setting yourself on fire to keep others warm only leaves you in ashes. I gave my son everything, and he gave me back the one thing I had lost, myself. And in the quiet, steadfast love I now have for my own life, I have found a happiness far more profound and enduring than any I ever hoped to find through him. My story is no longer a tragedy. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and it is finally, completely, my own.